Okay, welcome back, everybody. We just finished talking about biogeography as evidence for evolution, and we're just going to now finish off this chapter and work through our last few pieces of evidence. One other piece, the next one we're going to talk about, is comparing anatomy between organisms and also looking at embryos of different organisms and comparing those. So, vertebrates all go through very similar embryological stages. Um, so in here we have a picture of a tortoise on the left. The two left pictures are a tortoise, and the two right pictures are a chicken. And as you can see, at certain um, and all vertebrates go through these stages. If you remember, we talked about those Hox genes for development when we were discussing genes getting turned on and off and how so many animals share those developmental genes. Well, vertebrates share even more. They all have gill slits, these pharyngeal slits during development, even though, these are land-based animals. And they breathe air once they hatch out. During phases of development, all vertebrates have these slits, all have this tail. Even humans, even though we don't have a tail now. So this indicates our shared ancestry. We can also look and compare anatomy, which is so cool. So these are forelimbs, the front, arms or front legs of four different vertebrates. And as you can see, they've colored in the bones that are the same as one another. And so just like with that, the horse and the evolution of the horse, different bones change shape, they fuse, they lengthen, they shorten. Same thing has happened with all of these our bones. So we all land vertebrates descended from originally our ancestor was a fish that made it onto land. So the bones that were there in the fish fin are the bones that we had to work with. Evolution and natural selection don't just come up with brand new things, right? There could be a mutation, and that mutation would be a shorter limb or a slightly longer limb or fused limbs, but it's very unlikely for a brand new bone to show up. So we're working with the bones that are there, and that's what gets tweaked. So there's no perfection here. Natural selection does not lead to perfection, it just leads to changes. And those changes can be good, in which they may be selected for, or they may be less good, and they'll be selected against. So we can compare the hand of a human to the bones of a dog, and you can see all of these bones are the same. In the bird, their digits some have really lengthened, right, and fused together. Um, but they can pick out some of these same digits in there that have all fused. For the whale, these digits have really short. I mean, these bones, like the humerus has really shortened and thickened, and the these bones have fused together. So many of these bones have fused, and then their digits have lengthened for the whale. But you can still see that they share an ancestor who had all of these same bones. So these traits in them, when they're due to a common ancestor, are called homologous. So homo means the same. And so these are similarities due to shared ancestry. So we can trace a lot of evolution by looking at these homologous structures. Now, one thing that you have to be careful with if you are looking at like an organism is making sure you're looking at a structure that's due to shared ancestry, like a bat wing and a human arm, right? Versus an analogous structure, which means that they serve the same purpose, so they look similar, but they're not due to shared ancestry. So it'll be like a butterfly wing and a bat wing. They're both for flying, so they both have this large surface area, very, very thin membranous skin, right? But they are not related in any way, right? They've evolved from completely different backgrounds. Same thing with if we look at the body shape of a shark, right? Let's put a fin on him. and a dolphin who's also going to get a fin like that. And then we'll put in a penguin there who doesn't have a fin. They all have a very similar body shape. They have evolved from very different organisms, right? The shark is a fish. The whale or dolphin evolved from a land mammal that then moved back to the ocean. And the bird evolved on land too, from dinosaurs from a flying bird, became flightless and took to water, right? And so the dolphin or whale and the penguin evolved this body shape to better move quickly in the water. If you want to move fast in the water, better to have a real hydrodynamic shape, right? So individuals who were had that bullet shape would be selected for, and a bird that looks more like a sparrow would be selected against. That's not a great swimming shape. So if you want to move fast in the water and catch prey, you should look like this. So those are analogous body shapes due to convergent evolution. They all converged on the same solution. The problem was swimming fast in the water, and the solution is have a bullet-shaped body, right? So they came at it from different backgrounds. So those are not homologous. Those are analogous body shapes. So homologies and analogies could look the same, but the homology is due to shared ancestry. Another great piece of evidence for evolution when we're looking at skeletons is looking at vestigial limbs. So, as we said, the whale evolved from land animals, right? Land mammals that went to water. Maybe there was better food supply in the water, less competition in the water. For whatever reason, they moved to the water and eventually became full-time, water living animals. But they used to have 4 legs, and they still retain a pelvis. It's not used. They don't have any legs attached to it, but it's not hurting them, right? So it's still there. It's just hanging out. There has been no selection against it. There was selection against the back legs. Those were getting in the way, but there's no selection against that pelvis, so the pelvis remains. Some snakes actually, some species of snake have retained little nubbins there from their ancestors, which had legs. And humans have a fair number of vestigial traits as well. So our wisdom teeth, more useful when we were really chewing hard food, maybe raw stuff and gnawing at bones or something like that. Now our jaws are much smaller and we don't really have room for them, or not everybody does. Erector pili, this is really cool. So these are the little muscles that make the hairs on your arm stand up. So think for a minute, like what is the purpose of your hair standing up? There are 2 times when that might happen, right? So your hair would stand up when you're cold or when you're scared. And at this point, it serves no purpose. If we had a lot of hair, a lot of body hair, which is in general a vestigial trait, because it's not keeping us warm, right? There's not enough there to do anything. But if we had a lot of body hair and it fluffed up, we could trap some heat in there, which some animals do in the winter. They'll fluff themselves up, or you may see birds fluffing up their feathers, and they're trapping some warm air in there. Also, when you're scared, if anybody here has a dog, you may have seen when it's excited or meeting a new dog, when it's aggressive or scared, it may raise up all of the hair like along its back, those hackles. That is to look bigger or to display for another dog. If you're scared, you may feel the hair on the back of your neck stand up, or your arms, right? Give you goosebumps. That's the same thing, but it's not really showing anybody anything now, right? Other vestigial traits we still have that. We still have a tailbone, which isn't doing much other than getting broken every now and then, right? And an appendix. There's some evidence that maybe the appendix serves a purpose, but it certainly can be removed without hurting people, right? You don't need it to live, but it may have in the past been much more important. Okay, a piece of evidence for evolution that Darwin did not have was looking at DNA, right? So we can look at and compare DNA to see how organisms have evolved, which is what you were doing in the elephant lab, right? You can see that which population an elephant came from because it has very similar DNA to others in that population. And it's different from populations that are far away from it because they haven't interbred, right? So same species, but small differences have built up between populations. Um, and we can even look at things even more different than one population of elephants to another because all DNA is read in the exact same way. Right? When we looked at that codon chart and we were looking at translation, it's all translated and read in the exact same way. It's universal. So you could compare a gene between two organisms and see how different it is and try to figure out, okay, how long has it been since they were the same species or since they shared a common ancestor and then both diverged, right? If this is the ancestor, they both have diverged since then, and how many changes have built up along the way over time. So, you know, that's just sequencing, and here it's showing you a few differences of DNA that have built up between this moth and this fly. And finally, we can do studies, right? If you have a hypothesis, you can actually test it out and do a study. And that's a great piece of evidence for evolution. So some of this Darwin did with his pigeon breeding, right? And then we have some evidence today, some of it more scary than others. So the evolution of antibiotic resistant bacteria is something that we can read about regularly, or the evolution of new strains of COVID, right? So bacteria and other like viruses, all organisms can evolve. Um, so here we have a group of bacteria, and on the left, you're seeing the red ones are not resistant to anything. Um, I'm sorry, the red ones are resistant to antibiotics, and the blue ones, ugh, erase everything I just said. The red ones are normal and are not resistant, so they will die with exposure to antibiotics. The blue ones are resistant, so they can survive in an environment with antibiotics. Um, that is not always an advantage, right? Just like with those flies, one can go without eating, one can eat. It depends where you are. In an environment with no antibiotics, this blue one may have no, it may not be helpful. It might hurt it. Maybe it's slower to reproduce, right? And so it actually, that's why there's fewer of them. So it's possible that it could get crowded out and disappear. But when antibiotics are introduced this environment, the red ones all die, the blue ones are left. They had that gene that enabled them to survive. They now reproduce, and eventually this resistant strain of bacteria is the only one. So if you are not exposing yourself or your food is not exposed to antibiotics, then there's less opportunity for any antibiotic resistant strains to kind of take over. The next thing I have is a video, which I'm actually going to put into the discussion. Have you watched that? And we're going to talk about it there. So it's looking at, you're going to look at these resistant strains of bacteria that are resistant to increasingly higher doses of antibiotics. One reason that antibiotic resistance in bacteria is such a serious thing is that bacteria don't only share their genes with their offspring, right? So through binary fission, a bacteria can divide and you have two identical cells that came from that. But they can also, just like as they're passing another bacteria, be like, want a piece of DNA? And it doesn't need to be the same species. So you could have beneficial gut bacteria that are helping you break down your food. One of them may have a mutant for antibiotic resistance. And it could just pass it on to a dangerous bacteria. So this is the problem with antibiotic resistance, is that if you get it in one bacteria, it could spread through, you know, a whole ecosystem of bacteria, not just the same species. So it can travel around. In the United States, most of the antibiotic uses is actually in livestock. So the FDA has put in some voluntary guidelines for phasing out antibiotic usage, but it's cows that are used for that are bred with antibiotics as part of their regular diet. It if for like mass livestock breeding, they usually feed them corn, and that makes them sick. And so they're given antibiotics as a regular part of their everyday diet. So this is a great breeding ground for antibiotic resistance because they're always surrounded by antibiotics. If you instead focus on purchasing grass-fed beef doesn't need the antibiotics in order to survive. It's more expensive, but you are not getting antibiotics in your own food, which you may have traces of antibiotic or of resistant bacteria if you buy corn-fed beef. But if you buy grass-fed, it has not been exposed to those antibiotics, and it is supporting a market that's not overusing antibiotics. And finally, just a fun, cool story, and I'll attach a little video for you guys to watch, is looking at the domestication of dogs. So dogs are actually the same species, Canis lupus, as wolves. And one of the questions is like, how long did it take for people to domesticate dogs, right? Was this a super slow process that took 15,000 years, right, for us to get here to where we are today? Or could we select pretty quickly for a tame animal? So somebody did an experiment not with wolves, but with foxes. So in the 1950s in Russia, there are a lot of fox farms that people would use for making like coats and things like that. And there was a geneticist there who wanted to look at the genetics of domestication. And there's actually been very recently a book written about this, How to Tame a Fox. So if you're interested in reading more, this could be some reading material for you. So he hypothesized, right, that there's this variation in tameness. Some are naturally, they have all these cages of wild foxes. Some are naturally a little less like aggressive towards humans than others. And he thought that that would be genetic and not a learned trait. And if that was so, if it's genetically based, there's variation and it's inherited, that he could select for tameness, right? Breed the tame ones and end up with a tame strain. So if that's true, just think about how quickly it would take for him to get like a tame or domestic fox. So really quickly, kind of slow, or like a really long time. And he's been doing this for 40 years. So he's got a long experiment going on here. What he did was he designed an experiment so that he could test that. So he took the tamest foxes and he bred them with each other. He would just kind of test who wouldn't like snarl at him when he walked by. And what he found was, so he rated them for how friendly they were. And the number of those friendly foxes increased in frequency over generations because he kept just breeding the friendly ones. And they increased some other dog-like behaviors. So they started like licking hands and competing for attention with humans, kind of rolling over for tummy rubs. All of those things started happening. By 35 generations, he had like 70 to 80% of them show these really, really dog-like behaviors. But interestingly, there were other changes too that came along, right? So there's some linked genes that he wasn't selecting for. So he was selecting for decreased aggression. Need some petting allowed, right? They started wagging their tails, they started following humans. But by generation 9, we started seeing some other things. Floppy ears. He wasn't picking ones with floppy ears, but that trait came along. Piebald fur, so splotchy fur, a forehead star. If you think of all the domestic animals we have, so many have forehead stars. Horses, some dogs. I have a guinea pig with a forehead star. They also ended up with their tails curling up, and short vertebrae, right? He wasn't selecting for these things, but some of these things just came along for the ride. So you pick a change in one thing, and some of their hormone levels were changing, and that affects behavior, right? It's more puppy-like or kit-like behavior into adulthood. But those hormones can change other things as well, and then genes that are linked to those hormones were changing. Now, he wanted to really make sure that this was genetic and not environmental, right? If you have a friendly fox, she might just naturally raise friendly kits. So what he did was he then took two litters of foxes, one that was had an aggressive mom, and one that had a really friendly mom, and he swapped the babies. So the kits from the tame mom were raised by the aggressive mom, and the kits from the aggressive mom were raised by the tame mom. So if tameness was genetic, what would you expect? And if tameness was learned, what would you expect to see? So, think about that. And what he would actually see is if tameness is genetic and it's passed down, it doesn't matter what you learned from your mom. And that is what he saw. So the kids that had a biological tame mom, even though they were raised with an aggressive mom, were friendly. And the kids that were born to an aggressive mom but raised by a friendly mom were still aggressive. So that is just a really cool example of how we can select and show that evolution can occur because we can make it happen. And those foxes are actually for sale in Russia. I don't think you can get one here. But you can have a tame fox that like sleeps in your bed and acts like a dog. Okay, so we have finished our chapter on evolution now, and you can go into the discussions. I've got a few videos there to watch, and you can answer questions. Bye-bye.